Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Antonio Enriquez. Hello, Professor Enriquez. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be here.
I'm happy to have you as a guest on the show, Professor. And we're going to start the conversation by talking about institutions. Professor, what is an extractive institution? And are extractive institutions bad for growth?
Well, institutions, if you want the rules of the game, they can be very different, right? And we consider extractive institutions when there is some form of coercion involved in those institutions. Why they are bad for growth? Well, that is not evident, right? We can see, and I think the argument can be done for European feudalism, that otherwise, without some coercion, you could not aggregate and pool resources, so which would in turn be invested. So it's not clear that extractive institutions are always bad for growth. Though obviously, in the last centuries, 2 or 3 centuries, growth has come mostly from countries with less extractive institutions, with more market institutions. That's 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 the case most of the times, but not always. Mind.
Yeah, so look at East Asian countries, for example. Many writers are producing studies aiming to explain why some autocratic countries produce growth in the context of extractive institutions. So I'm just saying this because I do believe that free market institutions are superior to statist institutions, but when you look across history over several generations, the answer is not that quite clear cut.
Totally. And since I'm an historian, I I I need to check that out, right? That's what we do, historians. So economists came along with brilliant models and really big ideas, and we historians are those boring guys that try to puncture their balloons, right? So we try to find reasons, empirical reasons, why sometimes the models are not that good.
So,
So
so Antonio, we live in an
yeah.
age where some economists criticize deregulations, but evidence also suggests that regulations can impede business formation. So, if we're thinking carefully about extractive institutions, many of the regulations that have been passed across over the past several years in several countries are essentially extractive.
Uh,
So regulations, labor regulations, some financial regulation, because an institution, as we both know, is just not a physical entity. It's also undergirded by cultural norms.
Well, yes, but then you have to argue that there is markets that can operate without any institutional framework, right? Because what you are doing there is that you are equating regulations with any extractive institution. So the state has the coercive power. The state can be coercive, right? But regulations are not necessarily extractive. That's for sure, right? So the state needs regulate. The market needs regulations from the state, right, to keep running, keep going, right? So, for instance, since I work most, I've done some research on that. So, for instance, weights and measures, right? Weights and measures. It's a very it's a public good that 14th, 15th, 16th century European states give to the markets, that they are the guardians of weights and measures. And so you can, this is when, this is an institutional buildup without which the market could not work, or would work with much more imperfection. And the terms of change would be far more uncertain. And that would certainly harm markets. So, and your patron, may I say, Adam Smith, because in your icon you always appear with Adam
Yes.
Smith. Okay, so and your patron knows it very well, right? So you really need a state that locks up the bad guys, that makes some laws, that enforces the laws, that has a few judges, that has a navy, that has an army, and that provides some public works or institutions that could be helpful, right? And that the privates would not there to construct because they are not profitable. So even if you are a fervent believer in markets, it's very hard to argue that markets can exist without state institutions, at least empirically.
This is why the state capacity literature is growing.
Yeah, it is. It is. Actually, 1 hour ago, I was discussing with my co-authors, Leonor Costa and Nuno Palma, our paper about state capacity. So.
Oh yeah, do you have a new paper on state capacity?
It will be out in a few weeks.
Okay, what's the name of that paper?
Comparative state capacity.
Okay then. And what are the conclusions? What are the conclusions?
Okay, so this new paper. So we are dealing. Yes. Yeah, sure. So it's a case study. First of all, it's about Portugal in the long run. So since the 14th century up to the early 19th century, in which a period for which the literature has considered Portugal essentially like a bit of like an oil-rich country. So Portugal had a considerable empire, which provided lots of very valuable resources, and international and Portuguese literature insisted in the idea that this was essentially about extraction, and all those fleets that landed that brought goods to Lisbon were essentially did essentially sustain a state, and hence the state had no incentive to change or improve its institutions, and for instance to convene parliament, because it was a very wealthy state. The paradigm, I think, is the oil-rich countries of today, right? They do not have very good institutions, and one of the reasons is because they do not need to negotiate and try to build a proper fiscal system. And an interesting case, I think, that has come to the fore in the last months is Afghanistan, right? One of the problems of institutions in Afghanistan was that the prime sector in Afghan economy was foreign aid, hence political, and there was very little taxation. So the political power was about capturing a share of that foreign aid. So there was very little incentive to create a fiscal system, and hence to improve institutions. So the case of contemporary Afghanistan is really interesting in that respect, right? And in my paper with Nuno Palma, we also discussed that. I know you like empires.
Yes, you do. So you have been listening to the show. I do like empires.
Yeah, occasionally, yeah. So the thing is, when you are building an empire, at least in a European cultural and constitutional context, you need to negotiate with the property owners, with the people who hold property. You cannot simply seize their property. Okay, that's unthinkable in 14th, 15th, 16th century Europe. You need to negotiate. So the building of an empire gives you the incentive to negotiate. You need more resources, so you need to go to the people who actually hold the resources, okay? And you need to give them something back. And this applies to taxation, because you need to at least give something, at least some justification, but typically you need to give some public good. This applies to public debt. So you need to have all that financial capital that is in private pockets. Well, you need to give something back, right? Interest, namely. So if you are building an empire, you need to negotiate, and this is the basis for better institutions. Okay, and this obviously is counterintuitive if you think in very simplistic terms, in black and white, right? Empires evil, non-empires good. It doesn't work that way. And actually, English growth in the late 17th, early 18th century started precisely when Britain, or England and Britain then, started building an empire. They started to negotiate far more often. When was Parliament in England more powerful? Well, it was first during the 100 Years' War, when England was building up its empire in continental Europe, and then in the 17th and 18th century, when England was building an empire. And this is a period in which English institutions are clearly better than their continental counterparts. So empire empire and geopolitical pressures are really a major player in this institution's history story.
Yeah, empires can select for greater institutional expertise depending on the framework in which the state is operating. So it is often argued that there is a relationship. Well, sorry, I won't say that there is a relationship, but it is often implied that colonialism explains economic growth in the West. And these arguments were debunked years ago in a book by the late economist Paul Baroque. But Darren Acemoglu and Robinson some time ago wrote a brilliant paper, and in this paper, they identify the direct channel employed by colonialism to promote economic growth. And the conclusion is that colonial trade fostered the creation of better institutions that could enable growth. Because of the prominence of colonial trade, agents were motivated to create alternative institutions that could better maximize the gains of trade. So it is by this channel that colonialism promoted growth in England.
Well, that's, I think, complementary, but our point in the paper I mentioned was that institutions only throughout Europe, institutions are not that different up to the 17th century. That's our main argument, and then we have a sort of little divergence in terms of institutions that is a plausible factor, at least, to explain the little divergence in terms of income, and that's the point of our paper.
Antonio, before we delve a bit deeper into your paper, Comparative European Institutions and the Little Great Divergence, 1385 to 1800, it must be noted that you wrote another article, a 13th century fiscal constitution. I think that is quite interesting, because in the article, you're enunciating the claim that Portugal had relatively efficient institutions, and you write, fiscal constitutions, i.e. limits on the fiscal prerogatives of the state.
Yes.
Yeah, and this doesn't square well with the normal literature that Portugal's institutions were always extractive and relatively backward.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But well, I'm not in a crusade against what people say about Portuguese institutions.
No, I didn't say that.
I'm an historian, so I try to see to. It's irrelevant which country I come from or which.
Well, you're from Portugal. I didn't. Well, personally, Antonio,
yeah,
when I read academic articles, I don't really look at the sex or even the nationality of the authors.
Okay, great. But I'm saying this because I think in the 13th century, and I think in that paper I hint at that, is a sort of a watershed in constitutional terms for the entire Europe, for the entire continent. Really, It's when Europe becomes a sort of constitutional continent. It's when it's the Magna Carta, it's the center of the Magna Carta. But the Magna Carta is not exceptional in the sense that in the first half of the 13th century, in Aragon, in Castile, in Portugal, you mentioned, in the Low Countries, in the Brabant, Flanders, etc., you start to have a sort of constitutional texts and constitutional principles. They are not as media successful as the Magna Carta, obviously, but they are very important. The Portuguese case, the one that I focused on in that paper, is extremely interesting even for today. So today we are discussing who owns, who coins money, who owns money, what is money. Well, in 1261, the Portuguese communities, the municipalities, some lords, and some traders, they manage to force the king to accept what can be called a monetary constitution. That is to say, the rules according to which money could be produced, could be minted. Okay, how much money should be minted per year? What would be its features, so its fineness, its size, and its nominal value? Okay, so we have. I'm sure you are familiar with James Buchanan.
Yes.
Of course, right? The 86 Nobel laureate. Well, he said that it was quite utopic in a way that one day people will say, what are the conditions, what are the proper foundations for a constitution? And I think, and he put that day in a possible hypothetical future. Well, if you go to the 13th century, you see this happening, and not only in Portugal, you see this happening in a lot of countries in which the markets, if you want, or the private agents, economic agents, say to the king, and these are the limits to what you can do in terms of economic policy, or in terms of monetary policy, or in terms of property rights, and this is foundational for the whole story of economic development and growth. At least that's what I intend to explore in the next years, because it's when it becomes very clear that there is a pressure from above, from the state. The state is hiring judges, is building up fortress, he needs to hire officers, is building up clearly for war mostly, but it's building up, and the markets realize that there's something that the Romans talked about called property, and there's something that was more or less present perhaps in the biblical world or in ancient Greece, that is called limits to royal power, to royal prerogative. And that's something that dawns on 13th century Europe and not before. And Portugal is only one case, perhaps interesting case, because the specifics of the monetary constitution are quite impressive. But the 13th century is a watershed in that respect. So it's when the states become constitutional. Not that they have written constitutions, and actually that doesn't mean a lot, right? You see, you go to China, they have a written constitution, but what does that protect? Property rights or property owners? Not much, right? So it's not about having nice, neat constitutions, constitutional texts, but it's about principles that are formulated and to some extent enacted since the 13th century.
It's about predictability and confidence in the system.
Also, yeah, definitely. That's part of it. Totally. The market, if you want, these communities in Portugal, it's the municipalities that orchestrate this, if you want, a position to the prerogatives of the monarch. They want that. Yes, they need that. They need that to keep on with the businesses and with their investments, and the effects of this monetary constitution and are really visible. And you were about to, you kindly cited that article where I show that immediately after the monetary constitution, we start to see investment at low interest. Okay.
And Antonio, market, when we're on the issue, we're on the topic of markets, so I'm going to mention collectivism and communal markets. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Garrett Austin, but Garrett Austin is an Africanist, and in one of his papers he argues that African markets, their rights were communal, but based on all this, I don't remember the exact nature of the story, I read the paper some time ago, but what he's basically noting is that due to how their property systems were designed, even though they were not truly a free market economy, the market still functioned effectively. And this is just for Africa.
Okay. Well, I'm familiar with, but I'm afraid I cannot comment much on what happened in Africa. Really, really out of my league. Really.
Yeah, but interestingly, Antonio, usually when I'm speaking to global economists like yourself, I mention Africa because I think that Africa is the next big frontier in economic research.
Well, I totally agree with you. But I totally agree with you. It's a frontier in empirical terms, and clearly there's lots of work to be done there, and also in, as you're mentioning, in conceptual terms, right? Because it's you don't have many strong. You have many areas in which there aren't very strong states, and yet certainly there are areas where there are markets, and so in terms of its potential as natural experiment, I'm sure. Well, I trust it might be really important. Though I'm afraid I'm not the person to do that.
I developed a recent obsession with the economic history of Africa because we know a lot about Spain and Portugal, but there's so much about Africa that we don't know. We could spend an entire day talking about Spain, Portugal, England, Belgium, etc.
True, absolutely.
But what's
there's an interesting there's an interesting angle that's seen from the westernmost part of Europe, which, as you know, it's close to North Africa, which is very different from Black Africa, if you want, and there is so in military and technological terms, you can see that the Moors that were in the Iberian Peninsula had no worse technology up to the early 15th century. However, when we look at the descriptions of battles in the chronicles, you realize that in the 15th century, it became asymmetric warfare. It was not fighting like we like, and European steel has a lot to do with that. So it's something. Yeah. It's my very tiny contribution to that hopeful renewal of African economic history, which I really hope for, but I will do not much about it.
Yeah, the great divergence. But I'm happy that you mentioned North Africa. Ethiopia, the Ethiopians won the Battle of Adwa, and Ethiopia, long before the Battle of Adwa, was already adept at appropriating European military technologies.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just saying this from the standpoint of our states incorporate technology, because you said that Africa became relatively backward to Europe after a period of time, but some parts of Africa, like Ethiopia and the Asante Empire, they represent an exception in terms of their ability to appropriate military technologies.
Yeah, well, so let me qualify what I said. So we don't find that difference between Iberian and North African armies, Iberian Muslim and North African armies, and Christian armies. So they are more or less competitive, if you want. You don't see a clear technological advantage, right? Up to the early 15th century, okay? But then the Moors in North Africa quickly caught up with the European Western technology. And there are a few major defeats of Portuguese and Spanish armies in North Africa because of near parity in terms of technology. So it's about improvement in the West, okay, but nothing. The North African armies at some point managed to cut, to mend the distance. So they are competitive. They are competitive, and they managed to win a few battles, both pitched battles and sieges. So it's not a revolution, okay? It's not something that cannot be turned back in time. No, that's not what I meant.
Yeah. Jeffrey Packer, do you remember his book on military innovation in Europe?
Yeah, I know Jeffrey. Yeah, of course.
Oh, you know him personally. I
No,
should
no,
get
no,
him.
no. I know as an historian. No, of course, no, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay. I should get him on the show.
No, definitely.
However, the point still remains, Antonio, that Portugal and Spain became laggard. Why? What account for the reversal of Portugal and Spain, if not institutions?
If not institutions.
Yes.
Okay, so here I think you are, I think, referring to that paper on
Yeah, the
institutions.
same paper comparing
Yeah,
European
of course, of course.
institutions.
But I'm asking this because my colleague and I, my co-author and friends, we have fairly different opinions about what caused the great divergence and the little divergence, and why Spain and Portugal started the 19th century as relative laggards and had very lousy economic performance in the 19th century. And I think, and we go back to empire in my view, when do you start to see a certain the deterioration of institutions in Spain? When, in the middle of the 16th century, when Spain loses its up to then predominant position in Europe. Okay, up to the early 16th century, Spain is the hegemonic power in Europe. Okay, and is the kings are negotiating with parliament. Their public debt is not only very solid, although there are no real proper bankruptcies. Okay, there are negotiated bankruptcies, but the key debt instrument, the juro, continues to have the same yields and pay up without any haircut. So Spain is doing well in terms of institutions because it's still defending its empire. So building and defending empires, as I said, it's an incentive for rulers to negotiate with the property owners. Okay, but Spain's loses, right? Loses with France, has to sign the Treaty of the Pyrenees, so loses its dominant position and loses its ambition to increase its power base. And after the mid 17th century, and when incidentally Portugal defeats Spain again in its independence war in 1668, Spain no longer is no longer expanding, is no longer improving its empire. So the Cortes, so the Spanish Parliament, ceases to meet. Why? Because there is no need for additional resources. Okay, and public debt, which was struggling, was okay up to 1626, the first date in which the juros have a haircut. Public debt was fine up to 1626, started to struggle, and haircuts haircuts multiply. Okay, and sometimes the juro in early 18th century Spain is worth less than half what its usual value. So its initial value, sorry. So I think empires are a stimulus for building up better institutions. So this is how I would see the story of Spain. And mind that in the 18th century, Spain did not return to its position as a proper financial, as a proper, what historians call a financial state, a state that can operate a workable system of public debt. It isn't. There is some experiments with public debt in the late 18th century, but they are more or less, they are not comparable in terms of efficiency and performance with the ones that existed in the 16th century. So this is the Spanish story. The Portuguese story is somewhat different because Portugal managed to hold on to its imperial position longer than Spain. Okay, but so I don't see any sudden decadence in the mid 17th century. However, Portugal has a terrible start to the 19th century. Okay, because Portugal is from day one takes part in Napoleonic Wars and is invaded by 3 times, right? As all Portuguese students have to know, by Napoleonic armies, and the destruction is massive. There is a sort of burned. Let me check the English term. There is a sort of well, the way to fight Napoleon is, the French armies, is by destroying the countryside and ravaging the countryside in order for the enemy not having enough food to keep on its large armies. So it's a very destructive war, and it's followed by terrible 4 decades, of internal fight, because the ideas of the French Revolution inspire a sort of liberal versus traditional civil wars that start in the 1820s and go up to the 1850s. Okay, so it's when you mentioned Belgium. So Belgium is building the best railway system in Europe, in continental Europe at least. Everyone is investing in railways, for instance, or in many other industries. Portugal, which was not doing bad up in the 19th century, in the 18th century, has a very bad start of the 19th century, and in part for these sort of circumstantial factors. Okay? So 2
Antonio,
different parts actually for Portugal and Spain, if you want.
Antonio, can you do me a small favor? It's really minute. Could you do well, not now, obviously, but when you get the time and the resources to do it, could you do a comparison of monarchies in Europe? I'm interested in the link between monarchies and war and economic growth, and I would like empirical data to indicate or disconfirm the extent to which the monarchy in Portugal was truly a constitutional monarchy.
You mean up to the 19th century?
Yes, I want a study done by someone who's as brilliant as yourself.
Well, so I'll give my 2 cents on the subject. So I think the Portuguese. So there's this word absolutism, right? Absolutism, which describes a king that can do whatever pleases him, right? So and this is not, essentially this is not true since the 12th century. Okay, because property rights became an actual limit for the will of the king. So since the 13th century, it's very clear that not all land belongs to the king. There is private land that is owned by private parties. Okay, and they can even take the king to the court. So absolutism, if we take this very rough definition of absolutism, did not exist since the 13th century. However, up to the late 17th century, the monarchs had to negotiate extraordinary taxation and increases of ordinary taxation with Parliament. However, there's something that happens, and it's specific to the Portuguese Empire, which is the discovery of gold in Brazil. And the argument goes, many historians have done that argument, so I'm not at all pretending to be original here. The argument goes that since you have found huge amounts of gold that flow to Lisbon, to the Portuguese mainland, you don't need additional revenues. You don't need to negotiate taxation with the parliament. So you let go. The monarchs ignored parliaments, and that really happens in 18th century Portugal. So in late 18th century Portugal, early 19th century, we have a monarchy that does not convene, does not summon parliament. And hence, its critics or opponents consider that it is an absolutist monarchy. Okay, but still, I think this absolutism does not extend to the point of, ignoring property rights or ignoring public opinion, or even ignoring the local privileges and liberties. Okay, if you want, Adam Smith's writing in the 18th century, who often mentions Portugal, as I'm sure you are aware, in a way he says that a state should be strong enough to do the very little things that it ought to do, right? It should do that, but also it should be, if you want, absent enough and not for not taking care of things for which it is not able to, like, managing factories or creating factories or making private investments. So in that sense, Portugal has since the Marquis of Pombal, so since the 1750s, has a very anti-Smithian prime minister, who is constantly creating winners and losers in the economy, who is constantly creating new factories because of protectionist reasons. So I don't think that absolutism is defined is a very good description of Portugal since the 13th century. However, when Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, if you want, Portugal has indeed a very interventionist state that is intent on replacing private agents in lots of markets and sectors. So the bad side of absolutism really shows up in the second half of the 18th century.
All right. So
I don't know if this is really what you wanted.
Well, no, I like the story, but as I said, what I'm predicting is futuristic. I want you to do a future study that's empirical.
Okay, a futuristic study that is empirical.
Yeah, that's what I'm predicting. I want you to do an actual study. When you get an invite to my show, it's also an opportunity to do further research.
Oh, that's
yeah. I like to give scholars homework.
I'll give a good thought about it.
Yeah, but before I go, I must say, Antonio, that I'm from Jamaica, and in Jamaica, we actually study the age of mercantilism in Portugal and Spain due to the connection with Christopher Columbus. It's a part of the syllabus, and this story is taught to students quite early in grades 7 and 8.
Okay, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so we actually study Portugal, Spain, Castile, Aragon, the navigation project of Portugal, the entire work. Yeah, it's quite comprehensive. How comprehensive is the history curriculum for students in Portugal?
How? Sorry, I didn't
How
get the.
comprehensive is the history curriculum for students in Portugal at the high school and level?
Okay, so I think like everywhere in the Western world, uh, and I know this. I teach in university, but I know this from what I from what I see from my own students and from what I see from while discussing with foreign colleagues, is that more and more um, history textbooks are permeated by ideology. So there is less and less about facts and more about ideology. And
Unfortunately.
unfortunately, totally, yes. That's um, so. And also, instead of building up a proper uh, program, proper course, which would which would imply knowing important dates, important figures, important projects, uh, and and well, a few figures, and a few concepts like absolutism, for instance. Uh, no, it's more about uh, current topics and current concerns, but with 18th century clothing, really. So it's about always about racism.
Unfortunately, again, and my objection to the politicization of the curriculum in the Western world is that many of these academics and teachers don't know enough about the pre-colonial non-Western world to make an accurate comparison. That's the problem. So you cannot create you cannot indict the British Empire if you're not comparing the British Empire to empires in Africa or India.
Oh, definitely, and also I think, well, I think we should all agree that history should not be about ideology. It should be about knowing the truth, or at least having formulations that are not false. So we should all agree on that first, and then I think masquerading history as ideology, well, it kills the proper role of an historian, and that's why I'm so keen on going to these more public to the public sphere, like YouTube and blogs and such.
And this show and my show, my very academic show.
Yeah, especially your show. But the thing, what propels me to be as public as possible is that the role of history is to correct, right? Is to correct wrong ideas about the past. So we should always remember what George Orwell said about past, present, and future, right? So we and the role of historians is to make sure that no one controls the past. It's no present controls the past, right? It's the past is about debate about different. Sorry, it should be it should be not controlled by any single narrative. Okay, so when Stalin came to power, he left. Sorry, when the Soviets came to power, engineering books they remained the same. Chemistry books they remained the same. Mathematics, well, it did not change, right? But history and philosophy, oh, these changed. Why? Well, history changed. Why? Because uh, authoritarian regimes want to change the past so they can change the future. And the role of historians is to remain independent and as public as possible in order to let the past remain only the past. Obviously, subject to the interrogations and the problems of the present, but if we simply transform the past as a sort of rehearsal of our current concerns, we lose the miracle of having access to past experience, which should be seen as it's as it was as much as possible. So it has an intrinsic value. If we devalue the past by imposing contemporary concerns, well, we are doing a great service to ourselves.
Exactly. So I really enjoyed the show, but I'm also elated that so far we have been speaking for over 40 minutes and I'm planning to do shorter shows. So this is a major achievement.
Okay.
All right, then. It's just a pleasure speaking to you. Bye.
Okay, bye.
All right, then.